There are moments when a quiet, almost physical longing awakens inside, a yearning that refuses to be drowned out by the swirl of daily business, the steady pulse of screens, or the endlessly shifting noise of the world outside. It doesn't come with drama. It arrives quietly, often in the most ordinary moments. A pause before the day begins, a glance out the window when the sky is just beginning to turn gray, a lull in conversation when you realize you're still searching for something, even if you can't quite put your finger on it. At first, you might dismiss it as fatigue, the result of too much pressure or not enough sleep. But with time, it grows into something deeper. It's a subtle ache, a thirst that remains even after you've tasted everything life told you would satisfy. Success, pleasure, approval, the sense of belonging in a crowd. It is in these moments, so easy to miss and so hard to ignore, that the first seeds of quiet time with God begin to take root, not out of duty or habit, but out of necessity. You begin to notice that despite all you've accomplished, despite the laughter you've shared or the boxes you've checked, there is a kind of emptiness that can't be filled by the next achievement or the next distraction. Days pass, full of activity, but you catch yourself longing for something real, something that would anchor you, something unshakable. You realize that all the things you chased, success, relationships, new experiences, fade so quickly. The applause dies, the moment passes, and you're left with the silence that returns like a tide. In that silence, uncomfortable but honest, you confront the question that's harder to ask out loud. What am I really living for? Why does my soul still hunger for something more when everything around me tells me I should be satisfied? This restlessness, though it feels like a flaw, is actually the starting point of something truer. It drives you to seek beyond the surface, to listen past the shallow answers the world repeats over and over. You begin to see that maybe the deepest hunger isn't for things or experiences, but for meaning, for connection to something or someone greater than yourself. You might remember moments from childhood when wonder was easy, or recall a time when the world seemed full of promise, and realize that life has dulled those senses. Now, as you try to navigate adulthood, carrying responsibilities and old wounds, it becomes harder to believe that peace and joy are still possible. Yet the longing doesn't fade. If anything, it becomes more persistent. So you look for answers. Maybe you pick up a book, search for a new philosophy, or scroll through endless advice columns and motivational videos, hoping someone will say something that will fill the empty place inside. But the words, while sometimes inspiring, fade as quickly as the light on your phone's screen. You begin to suspect that what you crave isn't information or inspiration, but transformation. You want your life to mean something beyond the endless loop of expectations and disappointments. In rare, honest moments, you whisper to yourself that there must be something more, a depth that can only be reached in quietness. It is here, in this unguarded place, that the possibility of seeking God quietly enters the picture. Not the God of childhood rituals or distant traditions, but a presence that feels alive and willing to listen, if only you would turn aside long enough to speak. You sense that maybe, just maybe, the quiet you've avoided all these years is the doorway to the peace you've been searching for. The noise and rush of life, the pressure to perform and impress, have all built a wall around your heart. And now, for the first time, you consider stepping away from it all, just for a moment, to see what remains in the stillness. You remember stories of those who found peace in silence, who seemed to carry a light that nothing could put out. You wonder if their secret was not in what they did, but in what they allowed themselves to receive. A kind of presence that doesn't demand or shout, but waits patiently to be discovered. You think of words you've heard in passing, lines from psalms or ancient prayers that speak of a refuge, a hiding place, a peace that passes understanding. These words feel like echoes of a language your soul once knew, but forgot in the rush to grow up. And so the question arises, quietly but insistently, what if the longing isn't something to fix, but something to follow? What if it's an invitation to step away from the frantic pace, to carve out a space where you can simply be, and in that being, find that you are not alone? This is where the true journey begins, not with a dramatic conversion or a blinding revelation, but with a simple act of attention, a decision to give your longing room to breathe. You start to realize that the search for meaning and peace is not a flaw or a sign of weakness, but a call home, a call to the one who made you and who has been waiting quietly in the silent spaces you've tried so hard to fill. As the world rushes on, you begin to choose a different rhythm, even if only for a few minutes. You make space for silence, not because you know what will happen, but because you are finally willing to see what might be waiting there. It is a vulnerable step, one that feels both foolish and brave. In the quiet, you feel your anxieties rise to the surface, your fears about being unproductive or missing out. But you stay a little longer. You let the longing be what it is, a compass pointing you towards something deeper. This is the beginning, not of a new project or another self-improvement plan, but of a relationship. You begin to believe that what your heart desires most is not achievement or applause, but presence. Not just any presence, but the presence of God, who alone can meet you in your emptiness and transform your longing into rest. The journey has started, quietly and invisibly, with the courage to face your need and to believe that the answer is found not in doing more, but in learning how to be still. If you're ready, I can continue with the next narrative block, ensuring the seamless transition and the same immersive style. And as the days slip by, you notice how easily the routines of life take over. There's comfort in the familiar, in the predictable patterns that once promised security. A job to wake up for, meals to cook, errands to run, and the small pleasures that fill the gaps between obligations. The world applauds consistency and praises those who keep everything under control. Friends and colleagues exchange stories of productivity, comparing busyness as if it were a badge of honor. You smile, nod, and play your part in the script, telling yourself that if you just keep moving, keep achieving, everything will eventually fall into place. But beneath the surface, something has shifted. The old answers, the ones that once soothed your uncertainty, no longer quiet the ache inside. You try to reason with yourself. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe you need a break or a change of scenery. But even rest feels thin and temporary, like water poured through cupped hands. The things that once excited you begin to lose their color, and small annoyances grow into questions that won't leave you alone. Why does everything feel just a little out of reach, no matter how hard you try? Why do victories taste sweet only for a moment before fading into the next list of things to do? There is a subtle emptiness in the victories that the world celebrates. Even in moments of success, you sense a hollowness that applause cannot fill. You collect compliments, achievements, new experiences, but each one dissolves into the next day's worries, and the satisfaction slips away before you can hold on to it. The cycles repeat, the rush to accomplish, the anticipation of approval, the silent letdown that comes after. You look around and see others caught in the same loop. Faces lit by screens late into the night, conversations that skim the surface, eyes that betray a hunger for something more real. You realize that busyness is a kind of shield, a way of drowning out the deeper questions you're not sure how to answer. The pace of life becomes a distraction, not just from discomfort, but from yourself. The world teaches you to outrun the questions, to fill the silence with noise, to avoid stillness at all costs. But you can feel the cost growing heavier, relationships that feel thinner, laughter that fades too quickly, a soul that grows weary from running in circles. No matter how much you accomplish, it never feels like enough. The sense of almost hangs over every day. Almost content, almost connected, almost at peace. Sometimes you catch yourself envying those who seem untouched by the struggle, people who appear to find meaning in the ordinary, who carry a quiet assurance, who aren't chasing approval or running from emptiness. You wonder if they've found something you missed, or if they've simply stopped pretending. You listen for wisdom in podcasts and books, hoping that someone, somewhere, will articulate what you can't say out loud. That all the striving, all the accomplishments, aren't enough to satisfy the hunger inside. The more you look, the more you see that the world's promises are always just out of reach, and the pursuit itself becomes exhausting. The truth starts to dawn on you, slowly at first, then with a growing clarity that won't let you go. The old ways of coping, the patterns you've relied on, are no longer working. What once brought comfort now feels stale. The rituals of distraction, scrolling, shopping, endless entertainment, leave you emptier than before. It's not that life is bad or that you're failing, it's that something inside you has awakened to a need that cannot be met by surface solutions. You find yourself standing at the edge of an invisible threshold, sensing that change is not only possible, but necessary. There's a growing urge to look deeper, to search for a meaning that can't be bought or achieved, but must be discovered. You begin to question the script you've been handed, the expectations, the measures of success, the stories you tell yourself to keep going. There is an honesty in this questioning, a quiet rebellion against the idea that more is always better. You start to see that what you long for is not found in having more, doing more, or being more, but in a kind of inner freedom that the world can't offer. You realize that the next step won't be found in the next accomplishment, but in a journey inward, a search that no one else can make for you. This is where the call to change begins to rise, gentle but relentless, like a melody you can't forget. It's a call to leave behind what no longer serves you, to let go of answers that have lost their power, and to dare to believe that something better is possible. You sense that if you keep following the old patterns, you'll only find more of the same. But if you listen to the longing, if you allow yourself to become curious about the silence and the emptiness, you may discover a new way of living, one rooted not in endless striving, but in a peace that comes from something far beyond yourself. The urge to change is not born out of restlessness alone. It is a response to the growing realization that there must be more. It's an invitation to step off the treadmill of expectations and step into the possibility of a life defined not by what you do, but by who you are becoming. You start to imagine what it would be like to truly rest, to live with a sense of purpose that is unshaken by circumstance. And even though the path ahead is unclear, there is a hope that grows stronger with each honest question you dare to ask. This is where the journey turns, from the endless pursuit of external answers to the quiet beginning of personal seeking. You are ready at last to consider that the change you crave is not something that happens outside of you, but something that begins deep within. And with this, the old ways lose their hold, and the possibility of a new life, one shaped by presence, meaning, and peace, begins to shimmer on the horizon, just waiting to be discovered. There comes a day when you finally stop running. It may not be a dramatic moment, no thunder or lightning, no grand realization, but rather a quiet pause in the routine, a slowing down that feels almost unnatural at first. Maybe you close the door to your room and sit in a silence that is thick with everything you have tried to avoid. The hum of the world recedes, and you're left with the beating of your own heart and the restless energy that doesn't quite know where to go. You notice, perhaps for the first time in a long while, the weight of all you carry. The unanswered questions, the worries you've packed away, the persistent ache that nothing has managed to soothe. At first, the silence feels awkward, even threatening. You are used to noise, to movement, to constant engagement. The mind, so conditioned to seek out stimulation, rebels almost immediately. Thoughts race, reminders of things undone, flashes of old regrets, the impulse to reach for your phone or fill the room with music or words. The habits of distraction are strong, and it takes effort not to give in. Sitting still exposes you to yourself in a way that is both honest and uncomfortable. You wonder how anyone can do this for more than a few minutes without losing patience or falling into the trap of restless fidgeting. But if you resist the urge to run, if you let the silence settle, something begins to shift. Beneath the surface noise, beneath the swirling thoughts, there is a current of longing that starts to rise. You sense that the restlessness is not your enemy. It is, in fact, the sign that you are on the edge of something important. All your life you have been taught to fill the silence, to escape from yourself, to equate stillness with emptiness. But now, with nowhere to go and nothing to prove, you start to notice what lies underneath. It is as if a new landscape begins to emerge, one made not of plans and achievements, but of questions and hopes that rarely get a voice. In this fragile quiet, the real battle unfolds, not with the outside world, but within your own heart and mind. Old habits rise up, begging for attention. Your thoughts scatter in 1,000 directions. What should I be doing right now? Am I wasting time? Why is this so hard? You find yourself remembering trivial things from years ago, replaying conversations, reliving mistakes, worrying about the future. The mind clings to anything but the present moment. It is almost comical, this frantic need to avoid just being. Yet, with every wave of distraction you gently resist, you discover a new layer of awareness, a subtle courage to sit with yourself, to let your thoughts come and go without running after them. Gradually, the noise within starts to lose its grip. You begin to realize that the silence you feared is not empty at all, but full of possibility. In its depths, old wounds surface, not to condemn you, but to be seen, and perhaps to be healed. You remember hurts you thought you had forgotten, disappointments you buried beneath busyness, dreams you dismissed as childish. The temptation is strong to get up and leave, to abandon this uncomfortable stillness for the comfort of distraction. But you stay, you breathe, you let the silence speak, trusting that it has something to show you. A new kind of listening develops, one that does not demand answers, but welcomes presence. You start to sense that there is more to you than the constant swirl of thought and feeling. There is a deeper self, patient and wise, waiting just beneath the surface. It is here, in this place of quiet, that the whisper of something sacred can finally be heard. Maybe it is the first time in years that you allow yourself to wonder what God might say if you simply listened, not with your mind, but with your whole being. The longing that brought you here becomes a gentle companion, not a problem to solve, but a guide through the unknown. The first experiences of this quiet time are rarely easy or clear. The heart argues with itself. The mind offers up every reason to quit. But if you hold your ground, if you let the internal chaos play itself out without judging or forcing it, you find that something unexpected begins to happen. The thoughts that once shouted now soften. The anxieties that once controlled you begin to lose their edge. You notice the sound of your own breathing, the feeling of your hands in your lap, the steady beating of your heart. There is a growing sense of presence, as if you have stepped out of time and into a space where you are no longer defined by what you do or how well you perform. With each new attempt, the silence becomes more familiar, even welcoming. You realize that in this space, you are not required to impress anyone, not even yourself. The pressure lifts, if only for a moment, and you experience a kind of freedom that is difficult to describe. You begin to see your own thoughts as passing clouds, not as truths that must be obeyed. The mind is still busy, but you no longer have to chase after every idea or feeling. You are learning to rest, not in achievement, but in being. It is here, in this fragile and holy quiet, that you start to believe change is possible. The world beyond your door is just as noisy and demanding as ever, but inside, you are discovering a new way of living. The battle is far from over, but you have found a place where you can lay down your burdens, even if just for a little while. And in this letting go, in this simple act of stopping, you discover a peace that is unlike anything you have known. A peace that feels like the beginning of something true, something worth seeking, even if you can't yet put it into words. The first real encounter with the depths of your own soul doesn't come with fanfare. It's subtle, more often marked by discomfort than revelation. After the noise falls away and the rush of distractions finally grows faint, you're left in a raw space. Just you, your thoughts, and the uneasy awareness that there's no one else here to impress. It's in this bare moment that the fear often creeps in. The fear of what you'll find, the fear of being exposed, even the fear that no one, God included, will answer back. You realize just how much of your life has been shaped by keeping busy, by running from the quiet corners where truth tends to linger. At first, it feels unnatural to listen for anything in the silence. The mind is so used to rehearsing lines, performing for imagined audiences, or arguing with shadows of people long gone. When you finally sit still, the spotlight falls on you in a way that feels both unfamiliar and intense. Every insecurity surfaces. The things you regret, the failures you try to forget, the endless parade of what-ifs and why-nots. You discover how rarely you let yourself simply exist, unjudged and unfiltered, before anyone, let alone before God. The urge to reach for your phone or to busy yourself with something, anything, intensifies. But if you resist, if you decide for once not to escape, something astonishing starts to happen. Instead of overwhelming you, the silence becomes a kind of mirror. At first, you're reluctant to look, afraid of what it might reflect. Maybe you notice a growing sense of emptiness or guilt for wasted time. Or you find yourself rehearsing old arguments or reliving moments you wish had ended differently. There is a temptation to believe that this inner mess disqualifies you from any kind of spiritual experience. That true prayer or connection is reserved for those who have it all together. But slowly, you start to see this isn't true. The cracks and imperfections are not a barrier, they're the invitation. The silence, it turns out, is not judging you. It's simply showing you what's already there. You begin to understand that the real journey starts where honesty begins. To stand in the quiet and admit what you actually feel, what you actually fear, requires a vulnerability that is both terrifying and freeing. The performance drops away. You stop trying to manage impressions or curate your emotions. You discover that honesty before God doesn't require perfect words or flawless behavior, only a willingness to show up as you are. In this moment, you catch the first faint sound of your own true voice, shaky, uncertain, but undeniably yours. It doesn't sound like the voices of others or the opinions you've internalized. It sounds like you, confused perhaps, but sincere. The idea of God meeting you here, in the middle of your uncertainty and imperfection, begins to seem less far-fetched. Maybe you've heard it before, in sermons or stories, but now it becomes personal. You start to sense that real relationship, real connection, can only happen when there is nothing left to hide behind. The habit of self-deception runs deep, and it's tempting to sugarcoat your prayers or avoid the hardest truths. But each time you choose honesty, no matter how awkward or unfinished it feels, something inside you relaxes. The fear loses a little of its power. In the struggle to hear something beyond your own thoughts, you realize you've spent so long waiting for a thunderclap or a dramatic sign. But sometimes the presence you seek doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it slips quietly into the space you've made by telling the truth. You notice a shift, a subtle peace that doesn't erase your questions but gives you the courage to ask them. You find yourself whispering simple, unguarded words. I'm tired. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. And in the quiet, these honest confessions are not met with condemnation, but with a sense of being heard. You start to understand that the goal of these moments is not to solve everything, but to show up again and again with your real self. Over time, you become less afraid of what you'll find in the silence. The monsters under the bed lose their shape. The regrets and fears become less terrifying when brought into the light. What began as an experiment in quiet becomes a habit of honesty, and in that honesty, the first seeds of a relationship with God take root. You realize that being alone with yourself and with God is not a punishment or a test, but the beginning of an authentic connection. Each time you choose to enter the quiet and speak honestly, the walls that once felt so necessary begin to crumble. You see that the very things you thought would disqualify you, your doubts, your wounds, your unfinished prayers, are the things that make your time sacred. You begin to trust the process, knowing that every moment of truth draws you a little closer to the peace you've been seeking all along. The silence, instead of being a void to escape, becomes a space where you are finally known, and slowly, quietly, where you begin to know yourself as well. Every true journey, especially one that leads inward, carries with it the shadows of doubt and uncertainty. The first steps into the unknown are rarely steady. More often they feel like walking through mist, every shape uncertain, every sound slightly distorted. After the first raw encounters with silence and honesty, you might expect a flood of clarity or reassurance, but what actually comes is far more ambiguous. The fears and worries you hope to leave behind don't disappear. They simply take on new forms. Questions multiply. What if all this effort leads nowhere? What if the quiet remains empty, the prayers unanswered, the longing unmet? What if you're simply not the kind of person who can find God no matter how hard you try? These questions are persistent and sometimes cruel. They creep in during the most unguarded moments, whispering that you are foolish for even trying, that others may find comfort and peace, but for you, the door will always remain locked. The vulnerability of opening yourself to the possibility of God is, at its core, a risk. the risk of disappointment, the risk of discovering that nothing changes. You start to see how much easier it would be to return to old distractions, to bury your longing beneath busyness or cynicism, to accept a life of surface answers and leave the deeper waters unexplored. But something in you resists giving up. Maybe it's stubborn hope, or maybe it's simply the memory of that restless ache that refuses to be ignored. You realize that doubt, far from being a sign of failure, is a natural companion on this path. Faith is not the absence of uncertainty, but the decision to keep moving forward in spite of it. The anxiety that your journey might end in disappointment is a mark of how much you care, how deeply you long for something real. Rather than disqualifying you, your doubts and worries are evidence that you're alive to the possibility of change. There is a peculiar kind of courage in continuing when you have no guarantees. You find yourself caught between longing and skepticism, between hope and fear. Each day brings its own set of worries. Am I doing this right? Am I wasting my time? And the temptation to measure your progress, to demand immediate results, grows stronger. But this journey is nothing like the projects or goals you've pursued in the past. There is no checklist, no finish line to cross. Instead, there is an invitation to trust the process, to let the unfolding happen at its own pace. You begin to see that the uncharted territory you're walking into is not just a new set of practices, but a new way of seeing yourself and the world. The familiar voices that told you to stay safe, to avoid disappointment, grow louder as you take more steps into vulnerability. You notice, too, how your own expectations threaten to sabotage your peace. Part of you wants a dramatic breakthrough, a sudden and permanent transformation. But real change rarely works that way. More often, it comes as a slow, uneven dawning, a gradual accumulation of small moments that over time reshape the contours of your soul. The doubt that you will never get it right is joined by another fear. The fear that if you really do find what you're seeking, it might demand more of you than you're prepared to give. The invitation to transformation is also an invitation to let go, to release control, to surrender the comfortable narratives you've constructed about yourself and your life. It is frightening to consider what might be asked of you if you allow yourself to be changed. You begin to realize that you cannot predict or manage what will come next. The path ahead is obscured, the destination uncertain, and all you have to guide you is the faint light of desire and the echo of a promise you barely dare to believe. And yet, the journey itself becomes its own answer. With every step into the unknown, you discover that it's possible to live with uncertainty, to make space for fear and hope at the same time. You find that the very act of continuing, of showing up to the quiet, of telling the truth, of admitting your doubts, is in itself an act of faith. The assurance you seek is not in having every question answered, but in trusting that the process of seeking is holy, even when it feels uncertain. Each anxious thought, each moment of wavering is woven into the larger story of your transformation. In the end, what matters is not whether you move quickly or slowly, confidently or with trembling. What matters is that you begin and then begin again, each day choosing to trust that the way will open as you walk. The journey is not about perfection or instant peace, but about the willingness to explore uncharted territory, to let yourself be changed by what you discover, and to believe that every step, no matter how small, is part of a much larger story that is still unfolding. And as you press forward, anxiety and hope become companions, reminding you that the path has only just begun, and that the best, somehow, still lies ahead. Across the centuries, the longing you feel has echoed in the lives of those who came before. The ancient texts you may have heard in childhood or stumbled across in moments of searching are full of voices reaching out from the edge of their own uncertainties, calling through time with the same ache and hope that pulses in you now. These voices do not belong to flawless saints, but to men and women whose lives were marked by questions, restlessness, and the stubborn decision to seek God even in silence and confusion. In the Psalms, you find words that put language to longing. My soul thirsts for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. These are not the songs of people who had all the answers, but of those who found themselves lost, afflicted, misunderstood, and yet kept searching. The psalmists cry out in anguish, rejoice in brief glimpses of comfort, and confess fears that sound strikingly familiar. They speak of seeking refuge, of finding God not in the noise of achievement, but in the quiet of surrender. There is no pretense here, only raw honesty. When I kept silent, my bones wasted away, one writes, admitting that hiding from God only deepens the ache. But when they finally turn toward the divine, even in brokenness, something shifts. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. The Psalms offer the reassurance that doubt, longing, and imperfection do not disqualify you. They are, in fact, the beginning of a real encounter. The prophets, too, tell stories of meeting God in the most unlikely places. Isaiah's call rings out to those who are thirsty and weary, inviting them to come without pretense or price. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. These are words spoken to a people lost in exile, hungry for hope. The prophets do outpromise an easy journey. They know well the valleys of disappointment and the wilderness of unanswered questions. But they insist that God is not far off, but close to those who dare to seek him honestly. The message is not about ritual or perfection, but about the willingness to turn, to let go of the past, to risk opening your heart again. The stories of heroes of faith are often woven through with waiting, silence, and the deep struggle to believe. Abraham, called to leave everything familiar, spends years walking by faith without knowing where he is going, clinging to promises that seem impossibly delayed. Elijah, burned out and afraid, flees into the wilderness and collapses under a broom tree, ready to give up. It is not in the whirlwind or the earthquake that he meets God, but in the sound of sheer silence, a gentle whisper that cuts through his despair. These stories remind you that divine encounter rarely comes on your schedule or by your rules. It is found in the quiet, after you have run out of answers, when you are willing to listen for a voice beyond your own. Even Jesus in the Gospels retreats to lonely places to pray. The Son of God, surrounded by crowds, chooses solitude and silence, sometimes before dawn, sometimes late at night, always seeking the presence of his Father apart from the rush and expectation of others. He speaks of a secret place, a hidden room where you can meet God honestly, far from the judgment of public religion or the noise of the world. He teaches that your Father sees what is done in secret, that the act of coming quietly and truthfully is itself an act of faith. He warns against hollow rituals and empty words, inviting you instead into a relationship built on trust and honest longing. In these ancient witnesses, you discover solidarity. You realize you are not alone in your search. Their stories don't offer formulas, but they do offer hope. They show that the experience of longing, of confusion, of waiting in the dark is not a detour from the spiritual path, but its very heart. Every cry, every moment of silence, every faltering prayer is heard. The ancient words echo through time, not just as lessons, but as invitations. Come, all you who are thirsty, taste and see that the Lord is good. Be still, and know that I am God. What you find in the pages of Scripture is not a map with clear steps, but a chorus of voices urging you to keep going, to trust that the one you seek is already seeking you. You are swept up into a story much older and larger than your own, a story where longing itself becomes the doorway to encounter, and where every honest search is honored, no matter how imperfect or unfinished it may be. And as you listen to these voices, as you allow their stories to mingle with your own, you begin to sense that the silence you fear may be the very place where God is waiting to meet you, as He has met so many before. In the wake of ancient voices and the echo of their searching, you begin to wonder what it would look like to seek God in your own life, not as an abstract idea, but as a daily reality. The hunger for something deeper is real, but how do you actually respond? The answer isn't hidden in lofty secrets or reserved for the spiritually elite. It is found in the ordinary, almost invisible steps that make up the fabric of everyday life. There is no magic formula, only a willingness to try, to risk quietness, and to practice honesty in the smallest moments. Prayer, in its purest form, is simply turning your attention to God, sometimes with words, sometimes with nothing more than a sigh or a longing look. It doesn't require perfect phrasing or polished theology. In fact, the most honest prayers are often the simplest. Help. Thank you. I don't know what to do. Some days all you can offer is your weariness or your frustration. Yet these offerings are enough. Over time, you find that what matters most is not the number of words, but the willingness to be present, to show up even when you feel nothing or hear nothing in return. Silence, too, becomes a practice, not just an absence of noise, but a deliberate space where you resist the urge to fill every moment. At first, it feels awkward and even counterproductive. The world trains you to equate stillness with wasted time, to measure success by productivity. But in the discipline of sitting quietly, you begin to notice what is actually going on inside you. You listen not just for a voice, but for the subtle shifts in your own heart. The silence exposes your impatience, your anxious thoughts, and your reluctance to let go of control. This is uncomfortable, but it is also where the possibility of real encounter begins. Over time, the silence stops being a void to escape and becomes a space where you can finally breathe. Reading and reflection, especially on sacred texts, are other simple steps. Sometimes the words seem dry, distant, or even confusing. But persistence reveals layers you might have missed at first glance. A single phrase, a familiar psalm, can suddenly break through with unexpected clarity, speaking into your specific moment as if it were written just for you. The goal is not to master the text or gather information, but to let the words soak in, to linger on what resonates, to ask questions, and to wait for the slow work of understanding. Perhaps most challenging of all is the inner conversation, the ongoing dialogue with yourself about what you are experiencing. You begin to notice the patterns of your thinking, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what is possible. You see, sometimes painfully, the ways you resist change or cling to self-doubt. This inner work is slow and often invisible, but it is essential. It is here, in the gentle questioning and honest confession, that you create space for God's voice to emerge, not as thunder, but as a persistent, quiet presence. There are real difficulties, of course. In the beginning, everything feels forced. You might wonder if you're just talking to the ceiling, or if silence is simply a form of daydreaming. Distractions multiply, old habits assert themselves, and impatience bubbles up. You will be tempted to judge your efforts as failures, to compare yourself to others, to demand quick results or dramatic experiences. Sometimes you'll go days or weeks without any sense of progress, and the urge to give up will be strong. But these struggles are not signs that you're doing it wrong. They are the proof that you are actually trying. Every genuine practice brings up resistance, because real change is slow and often uncomfortable. The important thing is not to give in to discouragement, but to keep returning, gently but persistently, to the simple steps: a few honest words, a moment of quiet, a lingering over a meaningful text, an open question offered to the silence. Little by little, the habits begin to shift. Your heart grows softer, your listening becomes keener, and the invisible world becomes a little more real. In time, you discover that these small, awkward steps are not wasted. Each one is a gesture of trust, a way of saying that your search matters, even when results are not immediate. The practices themselves do not earn answers or guarantee mystical experiences. Instead, they prepare the ground of your heart for whatever may come. They remind you that seeking is itself an act of faith, and that sometimes the most profound transformation is found in the quiet persistence of showing up, again and again, even when the way forward remains hidden. Modern life is built on a relentless current of distractions. Even when you try to create space for quiet, the noise doesn't stop at the threshold of your room. It follows you in, buzzing in your pocket, flickering across your mind, demanding your attention in ways so subtle you barely notice it at first. The practice of seeking God or simply listening within becomes a kind of battleground, not against the obvious enemies, but against 1,000 tiny interruptions. The pressure to respond, to keep up, to check just one more message or scroll for just a few more seconds is constant and exhausting. You sit down to pray, to reflect, to be still, and within moments your mind leaps to unfinished tasks, sudden memories, or anxious loops about the future. The world has trained you to respond to every vibration, every ping, every flashing light, until it feels impossible to separate what is urgent from what is important. This inner restlessness can feel overwhelming. Sometimes you find yourself thinking about things you didn't even know were on your mind: the argument from last week, a line from a movie, the latest news headline, a random image you scrolled past hours ago. Your thoughts bounce unpredictably, refusing to settle, making the silence you sought feel even more chaotic than the noise outside. You realize just how deep your habits run. The instinct to reach for your phone at the slightest discomfort, the urge to solve problems instead of simply sitting with them, the subtle anxiety that comes from doing nothing at all. The hardest part is not starting a practice of quiet, but staying there when everything inside you screams for relief from discomfort. Technology, for all its usefulness, has made this battle fiercer. Every device is engineered to capture your focus, to reward instant responses, to make silence feel like a failure. You notice how hard it is to let a moment go by unfilled. Even in quiet spaces, you feel the gravitational pull of screens and the desire for constant stimulation. It's not just external noise, it's the internal narrative that insists you should be more productive, more informed, more connected. The simple act of paying attention, of being present in the moment, becomes a rebellion, a refusal to be shaped entirely by forces outside your control. Yet the battle for attention is not just about resisting distractions, It's also about recognizing the deeper patterns that fuel them. You start to see that much of your mental busyness is rooted in fear. Fear of missing out, fear of falling behind, fear of confronting parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. The urge to distract yourself is a kind of self-protection, a way of keeping uncomfortable thoughts or unresolved pain at bay. But as you grow more aware of these patterns, you gain a new measure of freedom. You realize you have a choice, however small, to notice when your mind wanders, to gently bring your focus back, to practice presence without judging yourself for every lapse. This is not a battle you win once and for all. It is a daily practice, a moment-by-moment choosing. Some days you'll be swept away by the flood of distractions, only to remember, maybe hours later, that you had intended to be quiet, to listen, to pray. Other days you'll catch yourself sooner, smiling at the absurd persistence of your mind, and return, however briefly, to stillness. The point is not perfection, but persistence. Each act of returning, no matter how many times it is required, is an act of courage. You discover that your attention is valuable, that it can be given as a gift, and that the simple discipline of returning, again and again, changes you over time. The tension never fully disappears, but it becomes more familiar. You learn to expect resistance, to see your scattered thoughts not as proof of failure, but as part of being human. Slowly, you find small strategies that help. Turning off notifications, carving out moments of intentional silence, choosing a space away from screens, or practicing breath and presence before you open your eyes to the world. These are not dramatic gestures, but small acts of reclamation. Each one asserts that your life is not defined by the noise around you, but by your willingness to pay attention to what matters most. In this ongoing battle, you realize that attention is sacred. Every moment you reclaim from distraction becomes a small sanctuary, a place where the possibility of hearing something true is kept alive. And in those moments, however brief or hard-won, you find that the quiet you fought so hard to create is not empty, but filled with the promise of presence, the gentle assurance that, beyond the noise and the endless demands, something deeper and more lasting is waiting to be found. It's a strange kind of courage, the willingness to linger in silence until the illusions begin to crumble. You don't always realize how many layers you've built around yourself. Excuses, explanations, images carefully arranged for the world and for your own comfort. In the noise and movement of daily life, it's easy to maintain these stories. You tell yourself what you need to believe. That you're fine, that things will get better soon, that your motives are pure, that your failures are understandable, or, at the very least, well hidden. But in the quiet, especially when you commit to listening past the surface, the truth starts to seep through the cracks. At first, it's just a vague discomfort, a nagging feeling that maybe not everything you've built your life on is as solid as it seems. You might notice small things, the way you avoid certain thoughts, the justifications you reach for automatically, the old wounds you dress up as wisdom or strength. There are things you'd rather not admit, even to yourself. Maybe you've learned to present a polished version of who you are, one that keeps you safe from judgment and maintains your sense of control. But deep down, you sense the cost. You feel the tension between who you are and who you pretend to be. In the hush of solitude, with no one watching, the mask becomes heavy. True honesty isn't a dramatic confession or a single moment of revelation. More often, it's a slow, sometimes painful, unmasking, a process of letting go of what you wish were true so you can face what actually is. There is resistance at every turn. You might try to bargain with yourself, to explain away your regrets or minimize the things you've done or failed to do. There is shame in some memories, pride in certain grudges, quiet envy in dreams unfulfilled. But the silence has its own kind of integrity. It will not let you look away forever. Eventually, you're confronted with truths that can't be explained away. The sharp edge of jealousy, the bitterness you've nurtured, the places where you've been dishonest, first with others, then with yourself. Yet even as the truth comes into focus, there is a strange relief. The battle to keep up appearances is exhausting, and in this vulnerable space, you feel something softer waiting. You realize that the point is not to condemn yourself or to dwell endlessly on your shortcomings. Rather, it is to make room for healing by allowing the truth to be named. There is a deep liberation in speaking, even inwardly, what has been hidden. I am afraid. I am angry. I am lonely. I want to be loved. I don't know what to do. The very things you thought would separate you from God or from peace are, paradoxically, the things that create space for something new. Honesty is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of transformation. As the illusions fall away, you notice how much energy you once spent protecting your image, justifying your choices, or keeping your weaknesses hidden. Now, you begin to see yourself as you really are, not as the worst of your failures, nor as the sum of your best intentions, but as someone who is unfinished, still becoming, still deeply human. There is grace in this realization, a gentleness that wasn't possible when you were still running from the truth.
Sometimes, the truths you face are hard to accept. You see patterns that run deeper than you wish, habits of blame, avoidance, or self-pity. It is tempting to slip back into old defenses or to numb yourself with distractions. But you begin to sense that facing what's real, no matter how messy, is the only way to experience lasting peace. Honesty is costly, but the price of living in illusion is even higher. Anxiety, loneliness, the quiet ache of not being known, even by yourself. Slowly, you start to trust the process. You realize that you don't have to fix everything at once, nor do you have to have all the answers. You only need to keep showing up, to keep letting the truth find you in the quiet. Each moment of honesty, however small, becomes a seed of freedom. The silence that once felt threatening now becomes a place of refuge, where you are allowed to be unfinished, allowed to heal, allowed to hope. In this space, at last, you find yourself. Imperfect, yes, but real. And it is here, in the raw and unguarded honesty of the soul, that the possibility of genuine transformation takes root. The miracle is that in admitting your fears and failures, not just to yourself, but quietly, honestly, to God, you begin to experience a strange relief. You are not struck down or rejected. The silence, rather than becoming colder, feels softer, as if it can finally hold what you've brought into the light. You whisper the things you are most ashamed of, sometimes in words, sometimes only in a silent ache. I am afraid I will never change. I am afraid I am not enough. I am afraid to trust. Each confession, no matter how small, eases the burden a little. It is not that the past disappears, but it loses its power to define your future. You notice, as you continue, that fear's grip begins to loosen. You see how much of your striving and perfectionism was rooted in the terror of being found out, the dread of disappointing those you love, or the need to control what cannot be controlled. Now, instead of fighting these fears, you allow yourself to acknowledge them fully, without pretense. There is a courage in looking at the places where you have been hurt and where you have hurt others.
a quiet heroism in choosing truth over denial. This is the ground where real freedom takes root, not by erasing the past, but by allowing it to be seen and, in time, to be healed. In these moments of honest reckoning, you sense a presence with you, not a distant judge, but a companion who understands the full story, who is neither surprised nor repelled by your weakness. You begin to trust that you are not alone in your fear or in your need for forgiveness. The silence, once so intimidating, becomes a gentle invitation. Bring everything. Nothing is too dark or too broken to be named here. With each act of honesty, you claim another inch of inner ground, another breath of freedom. There is still pain, of course, and the process is never quick. Some days the old fears return in force, triggered by a word or a memory, and you have to begin again. But you learn that healing is not a single event. It is a journey of small steps, of returning to honesty, of refusing to let fear write the final word. Slowly, the shame that once silenced you becomes the very place where grace begins to speak. You are learning, perhaps for the first time, that forgiveness is possible, not just for others, but for yourself. And as you taste this freedom, you find new strength to live more openly, more gently, less driven by fear, and more anchored in the quiet assurance that you are, even with your scars, deeply loved. Forgiveness, when you finally reach for it, is nothing like the simple word you once thought it was. It is not a single act or a feeling that comes easily, but a process that moves through the hidden corners of your heart, unsettling and healing at once. At first, it seems impossible. How could you let go of the injuries you have carried for so long, the betrayals that shaped your defenses, the mistakes that seemed to define you? Forgiveness asks you to walk back through pain you would rather forget, to look with compassion at the wounds you have suffered and the wounds you have caused. But as you sit in honest silence, naming your fears and failures, you realize that nothing will ever change if the old debts are allowed to keep speaking. You begin haltingly with yourself. The hardest person to forgive is often the one you see in the mirror. You rehearse old accusations, relive moments you wish could be erased, and grieve the opportunities lost to fear or pride. It is tempting to believe that you do not deserve forgiveness, that to let go of your guilt is to excuse it or forget its cost. But true forgiveness is not forgetting. It is facing the truth without shrinking and choosing mercy over punishment. The teachings of Christ reach into this fragile place, insisting that you are not meant to live forever beneath the weight of your past. Forgive us our debts, he teaches his followers to pray, as we also have forgiven our debtors. The invitation is both simple and impossible, to receive mercy for yourself and to extend it to others, again and again. You start to notice how tightly you've held onto your grievances against others. Some wounds are raw, others half forgotten, but each one exerts a subtle pressure on your life. To forgive is not to say that what happened was right, or that it no longer matters. It is, instead, a choice to stop letting those moments define your present. You begin the slow work of loosening your grip, sometimes through tears, sometimes with resistance, often with nothing more than a whispered prayer. I choose to forgive, even when I do not feel like it. The words of Jesus echo in the quiet. If you forgive others their sins, your Father will also forgive you. Forgiveness, you realize, is not a transaction. It is a surrender of your right to stay angry, a release of the power that hurt once had over you. In the act of forgiving, something shifts. The old stories lose some of their sharpness. The faces that once haunted you become less threatening, and the shame that clung to your failures begins to lift. You see that mercy is not only a gift you give, but one you must receive, again and again. There will be days when the pain resurfaces, when the anger or regret returns, and you must choose once more to let go. Forgiveness is not a one-time event, but a practice, a way of living in which you learn to meet your wounds with gentleness rather than accusation. Through this process, you come to understand that forgiveness is the foundation of all real freedom. The teachings of Christ do not minimize pain or gloss over injustice. They offer a way through it, a way that does not end in bitterness or despair. The cross itself becomes the ultimate symbol of this truth, that the worst you can imagine, even betrayal, suffering, and death, can be met with love and transformed by grace. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it allows you to move beyond it, to build a new future unchained from old injuries. In time, you notice how forgiveness opens space in your life, space for joy, for tenderness, for new beginnings. You are no longer held hostage by your own mistakes or by the failures of others. The burden lifts, and with it comes a lightness, a quiet gratitude, and a deeper compassion for yourself and for everyone you meet. You discover that mercy, far from being weakness, is the greatest strength. It is the power that allows you to walk forward, unafraid, into whatever tomorrow may bring. If honesty cracks the surface of self-deception, and forgiveness loosens the hold of the past, humility is what truly allows change to take root. It is not an attitude you can fake for long. Genuine humility emerges from the slow realization that for all your efforts and longing, you cannot heal or transform yourself alone. There comes a moment when you grow weary of pretending you have all the answers, when the burden of self-reliance becomes too heavy to carry, and you finally admit your need. This is not defeat. It is the first breath of real freedom. Humility doesn't shrink you. It returns you to your true size, right-sized for a world where you are neither all-powerful nor completely helpless. You look back over your journey so far and see how often pride disguised itself as strength, how often stubbornness masqueraded as perseverance. In moments of success, you took all the credit. In moments of failure, you carried all the blame. The temptation to isolate, to struggle alone, felt noble at times, an attempt to prove your worth, to avoid appearing weak or needy. But now, stripped of your old illusions, you see that independence has its limits. It is in the quiet reckoning with your own limitations that humility begins to bloom. Admitting your need is not easy. There is a fear that if you reveal your struggles, you will lose respect or love, that others will see you as less than you hope to be. But what you discover, slowly and almost by surprise, is that admitting need opens the door to real connection. The more honest you are about your limits, the more space you create for others to step in, not to rescue or fix you, but to walk beside you. Humility is not humiliation. It is the soil from which trust and community grow. You start to recognize the quiet strength of those who have walked before you, mentors, guides, friends who listened when you could barely speak, who shared their own scars instead of pretending perfection. Their example becomes a light on your path, reminding you that no one makes this journey alone. Sometimes wisdom arrives in the words of a friend, in the gentle rebuke of someone who loves you enough to tell the truth, or in the patient presence of a mentor who believes in your capacity to change even when you doubt yourself. Their support doesn't erase your struggles, but it anchors you in hope. It is through humility that you learn to accept help, not as charity, but as a gift. You realize that what you once viewed as weakness is actually the bridge to relationship. You give up the exhausting effort to control every outcome, and in its place, you receive the quiet comfort of knowing you are carried, at least in part, by the love and wisdom of others. In this mutual dependence, you find a new kind of resilience. Not the brittle toughness of self-sufficiency, but the flexible strength that comes from knowing your place in a larger story. Humility also opens your heart to God in a new way. You stop demanding answers or expecting the journey to unfold according to your plan. Instead, you begin to pray with empty hands, ready to receive what is given, willing to be led where you do not fully understand. The prayers of the humble are not less powerful for their simplicity. In fact, they may be more true, born from the recognition that you are not the center of your own salvation. There is relief in letting go, in trusting that you are seen and known and helped, even in your weakness. This lesson, perhaps more than any other, marks the turning point of your journey. Humility does not end with self-awareness. It leads outward, to community, to deeper trust, to the possibility of real transformation. You discover that the help you need is always close, sometimes disguised as a friend, sometimes as a quiet nudge in your spirit, sometimes as the wisdom passed down through the ages. In learning to ask and to receive, you finally become part of something larger than yourself, a fellowship of seekers, a family bound not by perfection, but by shared hope and honest need. And in this fellowship, humility is not just a lesson, it is a way of living that sets you free. The journey of seeking God and living with honesty, humility, and forgiveness is never meant to be walked alone. Again and again, life demonstrates the quiet power of mentors and friends. People whose presence, wisdom, and companionship make all the difference when the way ahead is unclear. Their significance is often subtle at first, hidden in a kind word, a well-timed question, or the simple act of being present when words fall short. You begin to realize that some of the greatest shifts in your story do not come from solitary effort or private breakthroughs, but from the gentle, faithful presence of others who have traveled similar roads. Sometimes these mentors appear as teachers, people who share their knowledge openly, not to impress, but to invite you deeper. Other times, they are quiet companions who do not preach or direct, but who walk beside you in solidarity, bearing witness to your struggles and victories alike. The gift of a true mentor is not their perfection, but their willingness to share their process, including failures and doubts. Their honesty gives you permission to be honest too. In their stories, you find echoes of your own fears and hopes, and the encouragement that what you face is not unique or insurmountable. Throughout history, sacred texts are full of such relationships. Moses, strong and frail in equal measure, leans on Aaron's support and Jethro's wisdom. Joshua's courage grows under Moses' leadership, while Ruth finds strength and a future through Naomi's steadfast kindness. Elijah, at his lowest, is met by Elisha, a companion who refuses to leave his side even when the road leads into uncertainty. Jesus himself gathers a circle of friends, teaching them, eating with them, enduring their failures, and ultimately entrusting them with the future of his mission. After his resurrection, he appears first to those same friends, meeting them in their confusion and fear, and restoring them not with reproach, but with patient love. In everyday life, too, mentors may arrive when you least expect it. A teacher who sees potential you cannot yet recognize. A friend who listens when you are too weary to speak. A spiritual guide who points you to practices and wisdom that help you grow roots in times of doubt. Sometimes mentorship is found in brief moments. the nurse who held your hand in a hospital room, the neighbor whose quiet acts of kindness modeled what it means to serve, the colleague who challenged you to live with greater integrity. These people do not rescue you from your journey. They simply remind you again and again that you do not walk alone.
Sometimes, the truths you face are hard to accept. You see patterns that run deeper than you wish, habits of blame, avoidance, or self-pity. It is tempting to slip back into old defenses or to numb yourself with distractions. But you begin to sense that facing what's real, no matter how messy, is the only way to experience lasting peace. Honesty is costly, but the price of living in illusion is even higher. Anxiety, loneliness, the quiet ache of not being known, even by yourself. Slowly, you start to trust the process. You realize that you don't have to fix everything at once, nor do you have to have all the answers. You only need to keep showing up, to keep letting the truth find you in the quiet. Each moment of honesty, however small, becomes a seed of freedom. The silence that once felt threatening now becomes a place of refuge, where you are allowed to be unfinished, allowed to heal, allowed to hope. In this space, at last, you find yourself. Imperfect, yes, but real. And it is here, in the raw and unguarded honesty of the soul, that the possibility of genuine transformation takes root. There are days when the silence grows heavier, pressing in until it feels suffocating. You pray and hear nothing, reach out and feel only emptiness. The words that once comforted you, the encouragement of mentors, the wisdom of ancient texts, even the echo of your own prayers, seem to fade into the background, leaving you alone with your doubts. The old distractions don't satisfy, but neither does the practice of quiet or the rituals you have adopted. Your mind begins to whisper, maybe you were foolish to hope. Maybe God has turned away. Maybe you are not the kind of person who gets answers. You are tempted to give up entirely, to let go of everything you have tried to build. This crisis is not a detour. It is, in truth, the heart of transformation. Here, every illusion of control is stripped away. Your cleverness, your discipline, your old ways of managing life, all of them prove powerless. You are left only with your raw need, with nothing to offer but your emptiness and longing. This is a place of mourning for what you hoped would happen, and a place of deep questioning about what is real. You rage, you grieve, you bargain. The silence feels like abandonment, and your heart aches with the pain of unmet desire. And yet, even in this bleakest moment, something remarkable begins to happen. In the midst of your defeat, you catch the faintest flicker of hope. A quiet awareness that even though you are at the end of yourself, you are not utterly alone. It does not come as a thunderclap, but as the smallest breath, a wordless presence that steadies you enough to stay a little longer in the darkness. You remember the stories of others who have reached this edge before you. Elijah in the wilderness, Moses on the mountain, Jesus alone in the garden. Their loneliness and doubt are not signs of failure, but doorways to a deeper encounter. Little by little, you realize that surrender is not the same as defeat. When you give up trying to force answers, you make room for a new kind of listening. You stop performing for yourself or for God, and in that surrender, you discover the strength to endure the silence. You learn that faith is not always certainty or comfort, but the willingness to stay present even when you feel abandoned. It is here, with your hands empty and your heart exposed, that the first quiet victory emerges. It is not the triumph of achievement, but the victory of remaining, of refusing to walk away, of daring to hope that something good might still be possible.
Gradually, the crisis loosens its grip. You find a new steadiness, not rooted in your efforts, but in the simple act of remaining present. The pain does not vanish, but it becomes bearable. The silence, once threatening, turns gentle, and you sense that what you mistook for absence was, all along, an invitation to trust. In the aftermath of this moment, something has shifted. You are not the same. There is a new humility in your faith, a deeper compassion for others who struggle, and a quiet confidence that you can begin again no matter how many times you falter. This turning point does not end the journey, but it changes everything that follows. The darkness has taught you to wait, the silence has taught you to listen, and your own defeat has become the ground of hope. You step forward, a little more vulnerable, a little more courageous, and discover that the very place where you thought you would break is the place where a new kind of life begins. After the darkness, something inside you quietly shifts. It's not the kind of change that shouts for attention, not a sudden reversal or a blinding revelation, but a deep, subtle turning, a softening where you were once tense, a new steadiness where uncertainty once ruled. The crisis that brought you to the end of yourself becomes, in hindsight, a doorway. On the far side, you sense an unfamiliar lightness, as if some invisible burden has lifted, leaving you able to breathe more deeply and to see more clearly than before. You begin to notice the world with different eyes. Where before you scanned for threats or disappointments, now you find moments of unexpected beauty, sunlight falling through leaves, laughter rising unforced, the quiet presence of another person simply being with you. Ordinary moments, once drowned out by anxiety or the pressure to perform, suddenly become bearers of grace. You realize you are less quick to judge, less desperate to control outcomes. There's a widening of perspective, a kind of quiet spaciousness in your soul. Where you once felt hemmed in by your own fears or old stories, now you glimpse the horizon stretching out, full of possibility. This new way of seeing is not naive optimism. It grows out of the honest reckoning with your pain, your failures, your doubts. Because you have faced the darkness and chosen not to turn away, hope is no longer a fragile thing you must protect, but a living current flowing quietly through the days. The disappointments and wounds are not erased, but they are held differently, no longer as evidence that life is against you, but as part of a larger, mysterious journey in which nothing is wasted. Even suffering has become a kind of teacher, deepening your compassion, teaching you to hold space for others who struggle. Your relationships begin to shift as well. The need to prove yourself, to earn affection or justify your worth, loses its grip. You find yourself less preoccupied with how you appear, more willing to listen, to forgive, to meet others where they are. Old grudges fade, and the barriers that once seemed necessary now feel like unnecessary weight. You experience a growing curiosity about people's stories and a gentler approach to their weaknesses, knowing firsthand how difficult it can be to face your own. There is a freedom in admitting you don't have all the answers, a humility that invites real connection instead of competition or pretense. With this change comes a new resilience. You learn to trust the slow work of transformation, to be patient with yourself and others, to allow time and grace to do what force and effort never could. Failures still sting, and the pressures of life don't disappear, but you are anchored now by something deeper than circumstance. You start to live with a quiet expectancy, open to surprise, less threatened by uncertainty. Instead of clinging to control, you find the courage to risk, to try new things, to reach beyond the safe limits you once imposed. Hope becomes more than an abstract ideal. It becomes a way of moving through the world, a readiness to believe that good things can come, even in unlikely places. Gratitude takes root, not as a forced discipline, but as a natural response to seeing life as gift rather than entitlement. You find yourself more often in awe, less often in despair, more able to rest in the assurance that your worth is not up for debate. You begin to see with increasing clarity that the journey is not about arrival, but about presence, about showing up fully, honestly, and with a willingness to be changed by every encounter. In this new perspective, you are freer to dream, to hope, to love without fear of scarcity. The old horizon, once so narrow, has given way to a landscape full of invitation and quiet wonder. The change is unmistakable. You carry a peace that does not deny trouble, a hope that has weathered storms, and a gentle strength that comes from having walked through the darkness and found on the other side a love more enduring than your doubts. There comes a time when the words you once read out of habit or obligation begin to take on new weight, as if they have shifted from ink on a page into something alive and quietly powerful. The practice of reading Scripture is no longer about checking a box or meeting some invisible standard of spirituality. It becomes a kind of listening, an open-hearted search for what might be waiting to speak into the particulars of your own story. You approach the familiar verses with new eyes, less as a scholar dissecting text and more as a traveler scanning the horizon for a sign, a hint that you are seen, understood, and accompanied in ways you could not have imagined. Sometimes the change is sudden. A verse leaps out, its meaning clear and personal, as if it were written just for this moment in your life. Perhaps you find yourself wrestling with anxiety, and the words, "Be still and know that I am God," break through the inner storm like a shaft of light, calling you to lay down your frantic striving. Or maybe you are caught in regret, and the promise, "As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us," arrives not as empty comfort, but as an almost physical relief. In these moments, Scripture becomes less a set of rules and more a conversation, less a source of information and more a living presence reaching across centuries to meet you right where you are. Other times, the change is slower, more subtle, a gradual soaking of words into your heart, shaping your thoughts and reactions almost unnoticed. You read about the patience of Job, the lament of the psalmists, the doubt of Thomas, and you see your own struggles reflected in their stories. What once felt distant or irrelevant now lands with deep resonance, reminding you that you are part of an ancient company of seekers and strugglers. The stories of faith, failure, hope, and redemption are not just their stories, they become your own. The encouragement to cast all your cares upon Him, for He cares for you, becomes less an abstract invitation and more an experienced truth, proven in countless small moments of surrender and trust. There are days when a single phrase lingers in your mind, quietly working its way through your defenses. Perhaps it is the simple assurance, "I am with you always," that steadies you when you feel alone. Or the gentle rebuke, "Do not let your hearts be troubled," that nudges you to release anxieties you have held too long. Sometimes the words bring challenge, confronting patterns of bitterness or pride, calling you to forgive, to act, to risk loving more deeply. Other times they bring comfort, a gentle reassurance that your pain is seen and your tears are counted. The text is no longer just ancient wisdom, but becomes a living dialogue, shaping your choices and hopes from the inside out. Over time, you find yourself returning to certain verses or passages again and again, not as superstition, but as anchors, reminders of what is most true when everything else feels unstable. The rituals of reading and reflection are no longer duties, but gifts, a space where you are free to question, to doubt, to rejoice, to grieve, to listen for whatever word is needed in that moment. There is a new humility in your approach. You come not as a master of sacred things, but as one in need, ready to be surprised by grace. Most of all, you realize that the living word is never static. The same passage that comforted you in one season may challenge you in another. What once seemed obscure may suddenly blaze with meaning. The Spirit, you sense, delights in this dance, inviting you to bring your whole, changing self into the conversation, trusting that the answers you need will be given, not always on your timeline, but always with perfect wisdom and love. In this way, the words become woven into your story, not just as background music, but as active participants in your transformation. They become the ground you return to in trouble, the song that rises in your heart when hope is hard to find, the quiet nudge that keeps you moving forward when the way is unclear. And in every season, you discover anew that these ancient words are, at their heart, alive, inviting you always into deeper encounter and unshakable hope. Transformation rarely announces itself with dramatic fanfare. More often, it unfolds in the unnoticed corners of your life, a gradual reworking of thought, reaction, and habit that only becomes clear when you pause to look back. The journey inward, once marked by struggle and uncertainty, slowly becomes the soil where new patterns of living take root. You find that the practices of silence, honesty, humility, and attention to sacred words are not ends in themselves, but the means by which a deeper maturity is formed. A maturity that changes not just what you believe, but how you move through the world. At first, the shifts are subtle. You begin to notice a small pause between stimulus and response, a moment when you can choose a different way. The impatience that used to flare up in frustration now dissolves into understanding or gentle humor. You catch yourself listening more closely, speaking less hastily, holding back from old habits of judgment or self-defense. There's a kindness that slips quietly into your interactions, not just with others, but with yourself. Where you once pushed yourself mercilessly for every mistake, you now offer grace, understanding that growth is not linear and that missteps are part of learning. This new steadiness grows out of countless small choices. When anger rises, you remember to breathe. When anxiety threatens, you reach for words of hope or surrender. The cravings for distraction lose their urgency as you become more comfortable with quiet and stillness. You find satisfaction in the slow work of ordinary days. Chores, conversations, responsibilities that you once saw as obstacles to spiritual life now become the very context in which it is lived out. You become less reactive and more present, less concerned with appearances and more focused on authenticity. Even your desires shift. The old hunger for approval or control begins to fade, replaced by a deeper longing for meaning and connection. The pursuit of status, comparison, or accumulation loses its grip, and you find joy in simpler things: a kind word, a moment of genuine laughter, the feeling of peace after telling the truth. You are less governed by the opinions of others, less prone to despair when things go wrong. Instead, there is a quiet confidence, a trust that you are being formed by something larger than yourself. This path to maturity is not without struggle. There are days when you slip back into old patterns, when fear or pride reassert themselves, when the lure of distraction is almost overwhelming. But the difference is in your response. Instead of collapsing into shame or self-criticism, you recognize what's happening, accept it, and begin again. You become more patient with the process, more willing to forgive yourself and others, more determined to keep returning to the practices that root you in what is true. Over time, the changes become evident not just to you, but to those around you. People may comment on your calm, your attentiveness, your ability to weather storms with resilience. Relationships grow deeper as you listen more and judge less, as you create space for vulnerability and trust. You realize that maturity is not a finish line to be crossed, but a continual process of being shaped and reshaped by grace, day after day. The habits you build become second nature, a rhythm of living that draws you back to what matters most. The old anxieties and compulsions still whisper, but their voices are softer now, no longer able to command your days. In their place is a quiet joy, a steady hope, and an openness to life as it comes. This is the slow, powerful work of transformation, not flashy or instant, but deep, enduring, and utterly real. It is a gift you receive, moment by moment, and a gift you pass on, often without even realizing, to everyone you meet.
No matter how much you grow, the old temptations and patterns rarely vanish for good. They linger on the edges of your life, waiting for moments of fatigue, loneliness, or disappointment to press in again. The progress you've made does not mean you are immune to stumbling. In fact, new maturity often exposes even subtler forms of weakness. Sometimes, the habits you thought were behind you reappear with unexpected force, catching you off guard and stirring old voices of shame and frustration. It's easy in these moments to believe that you have failed completely, that the journey has led you in circles rather than forward. The return of old struggles can feel especially bitter after seasons of apparent victory. You may find yourself surprised by the force of anger in a stressful moment, or reach for distractions you thought you had outgrown. Sometimes, old patterns of self-doubt, comparison, or fear resurface in the very relationships or situations where you most hoped to see change. The disappointment can be sharp, especially when you start to measure yourself against an imagined ideal of uninterrupted progress. It's tempting to give in to discouragement, to listen to the inner critic that whispers, "You'll never really change." But the story is not as hopeless as it seems in those moments. The real test of growth is not found in perfection, but in how you respond to falling short. The old instinct might be to hide, to retreat in shame, to give up on the practices that once brought you closer to God. But now, having experienced a different way of being, you recognize the patterns more quickly. The voice of shame is familiar, but it no longer commands your obedience. Instead, you learn to pause, to admit what has happened without excuses or denial, and to return, gently but persistently, to the practices that ground you: silence, prayer, truth-telling, and the acceptance of grace. This returning is its own act of faith. You realize that failure is not the opposite of progress, but a companion along the way. Each time you slip, you are invited to remember what you've learned about forgiveness, humility, and starting over. The internal dialogue shifts. Instead of berating yourself or pretending nothing happened, you speak honestly to God about your struggle. You name your weakness, your disappointment, and your longing for help. In this space, the relationship is tested and deepened, not because you are flawless, but because you trust enough to return. Over time, you notice that the cycle of falling and returning shapes you in ways uninterrupted success never could. Each confession, each small act of coming back becomes a practice of faithfulness, a stubborn refusal to let failure have the final word. The habits of running or hiding slowly lose their power, replaced by a steadying habit of honesty and hope. You discover that God's patience is greater than your worst days, that mercy waits for you not just at the start of your journey, but at every stumble along the way.
The setbacks do not erase the progress you've made. Instead, they become reminders of your need and your belonging, invitations to deepen your trust in grace. The process is humbling, sometimes painful, but also liberating. You see that being human means contending with weakness again and again, and that true growth is measured not by perfection, but by persistence. The cycle of falling and returning becomes a rhythm, a way of living that keeps you grounded in reality and open to transformation. And so, with each return, you find yourself less discouraged by imperfection and more grateful for the resilience that keeps you moving forward. The old temptations may never vanish entirely, but they lose their power to define you. Each struggle becomes another opportunity to rediscover the mercy that welcomes you back, to reaffirm your commitment, and to trust that even here, in the messy, unfinished reality of daily life, grace is at work, patiently leading you home. There comes a moment, often quietly and without warning, when you realize the struggle has given way to something deeper, a calm that does not depend on circumstances, a kind of peace that defies explanation. This peace is not a reward for effort or the absence of trouble. It is an unshakable center formed in the midst of chaos, the steady presence that remains even when life is uncertain. You notice it most on days when the world is anything but peaceful, when pressures mount, when old anxieties threaten, when nothing seems to go as planned. In these moments, you find yourself anchored by something that no storm can reach. This inner stability doesn't come all at once. It grows slowly, almost invisibly, out of countless choices to return, to truth, to honesty, to the practices that quiet your soul. You begin to trust that peace is not something you manufacture, but something you receive, a gift that flows from letting go of control and trusting what is greater than you. It's the assurance that you are held, even when you feel fragile, that your worth is secure, even when success and approval are absent, that you are not alone, even in the loneliest hours. The old need to prove yourself begins to fade. The restlessness that once drove you is replaced by a gentle confidence, a sense that you can face what comes, not because you are unbreakable, but because you are grounded in something timeless and true. This doesn't mean you never feel fear or pain, but the fear no longer rules you, and the pain no longer defines you. The stillness within becomes a sanctuary, a place you can return to again and again, no matter what is happening outside. You start to see this peace reflected in your actions. You respond to provocation with patience, meet setbacks with quiet resilience, offer kindness without needing anything in return. The drama of comparison, competition, and striving loses its appeal. Instead, you find joy in simplicity, gratitude in the ordinary, and a surprising sense of safety in letting go of outcomes you cannot control. The same circumstances that once unraveled you now reveal the depth of your roots. This deep, inexplicable peace is connected to truths that endure beyond your changing emotions and shifting fortunes. You remember, sometimes with astonishment, that the promises spoken long ago are still true, that you are loved with an everlasting love, that your failures are not the final word, that hope endures even in the darkest seasons. The foundation of your life is no longer at the mercy of external events. Instead, it rests on what cannot be shaken: the presence of God, the assurance of grace, the quiet conviction that all will be well, even when you cannot see how. In conversations and relationships, this peace becomes a quiet gift you bring into every room. Others notice, not always in words, but in the calm you carry, in the way you listen, in the steadiness of your presence. You are not untouched by difficulty, but you are no longer captive to it. There is a freedom in knowing that your spirit is anchored, your heart unafraid of storms. You are able to comfort others without absorbing their anxieties, to meet challenges without losing your balance, to rest even in uncertainty. And so, this peace, impossible to explain, unmistakable when found, becomes the secret center of your life. It is not an achievement to boast of, but a gift to cherish, nurtured in silence, trial, and trust. It reminds you again and again that you are part of a story much larger than your circumstances, held fast by a love that will not let you go. In this place of quiet confidence, you find the freedom to live fully, love boldly, and meet whatever comes with a heart at rest. There is a subtle but profound transformation that unfolds when you no longer live hidden behind masks or driven by old anxieties. The journey through struggle, silence, and surrender has not made you perfect, but it has made you real. Gone is the need to curate every detail of your image or to manage how others see you. In its place is an authenticity that feels like coming home to yourself. You move through your days with a new ease, no longer shaped by the need to impress, to defend, or to pretend. The freedom to be honest, with yourself, with God, with others, becomes a quiet, sustaining joy, an inner permission to bring your whole self into every moment, shadow and all. You notice how the fear that once kept you small has lost its grip. Old patterns of self-criticism, performance, or hiding fade, replaced by a growing comfort in your own skin. You are more willing to admit weakness, to laugh at your mistakes, to seek help when you need it. Vulnerability no longer feels like danger, but like the only place real connection can begin. There is an openness in your relationships, a readiness to meet others as they are, free from the calculations and comparisons that used to exhaust you. You offer your presence as a gift, not a transaction. You love not out of compulsion, but out of the overflow of a heart that has learned it is deeply loved. Faith, once a struggle for answers or an obligation to uphold, becomes a living trust, a steady reliance on the one who has walked with you through every storm and silence. You begin to sense that the true meaning of faithfulness is not rigid perfection, but returning again and again to what is real, truth, mercy, humility, hope. Each day you choose integrity, not because you fear punishment, but because honesty has become your native language. You forgive more quickly, receive forgiveness more freely, and see each encounter as an opportunity to serve, to listen, to embody grace. As you live more openly, the horizon of your life expands. You are no longer defined by your past or limited by your failures. The future is not a source of anxiety, but an invitation to risk, to hope, to create, to love. You find yourself dreaming dreams that once felt impossible, not dreams of status or security, but of meaning, of kindness, of leaving behind a legacy of quiet courage. Even as challenges come, you trust that you have what you need. You trust that you are not alone. In this freedom, there is a new attentiveness to eternity, not as a far-off abstraction, but as a reality that quietly shapes your days. You sense the nearness of what is timeless, the love that outlasts loss, the peace that survives every storm, the hope that glimmers even in endings. You live, now, with one eye on what is unseen, not in escapism, but in a deep awareness that your life is woven into a much larger story, that every act of kindness or honesty ripples beyond what you can see. The journey has led you to a place where faith and authenticity are inseparable, where the call to be yourself is the same as the call to be true to God. You do not walk this path alone. As you become more fully yourself, you notice how your courage gives others permission to do the same. Community grows, not around perfection, but around honesty and hope. The masks come off, and what remains is more beautiful than anything you could have engineered. A gathering of lives, flawed and radiant, each bearing the mark of mercy, each telling a story of transformation. Looking ahead, you embrace life as gift, a trust that every day is an opportunity to become more yourself, to love more deeply, to rest in the knowledge that you are known and held. And as you step forward, free and unguarded, you sense that this is only the beginning, a new kind of life that will never end, a foretaste of the eternity for which your heart was always meant. A quiet revolution takes place when the boundaries between sacred and ordinary begin to dissolve. What once seemed like isolated moments of faith or rare encounters with meaning now spill over into the fabric of daily life. The transformation you've experienced inside, the honesty, the trust, the peace, becomes the silent undercurrent of your every action. You find yourself moving through the world differently, not compartmentalizing spiritual life from everything else, but allowing prayer to seep into the very edges of your routine, infusing each moment with new depth. Simple tasks, washing dishes, walking down the street, answering an email, take on the feel of quiet rituals. The ordinary is no longer something to rush through or escape. It becomes a field where gratitude and presence grow. You notice how much of your old anxiety came from separating the important spiritual moments from the mundane hours in between. Now you realize that nothing is truly wasted or meaningless. Every encounter, every interruption, every small responsibility becomes an opportunity to practice love, patience, and hope. Your work is no longer just a means to an end, but a way to serve, to bless, to be attentive to the needs and stories around you. Relationships, too, become prayer. Instead of measuring or managing interactions, you find yourself more open, more present, more willing to see others with the eyes of compassion. A conversation with a friend becomes a sacred space. A moment of listening becomes a gift offered freely, without expectation. Even conflict and disappointment are held with greater gentleness, as invitations to deeper understanding and forgiveness. Your heart is more available, your judgments quieter, your willingness to care unforced and sincere. You discover that even your weaknesses and struggles can be woven into prayer. On hard days, when old doubts or habits return, you bring them honestly, without shame, as offerings rather than failures. Each frustration, each ache becomes a wordless plea for help or a quiet surrender. In this way, nothing is excluded from the new reality. You are learning to pray not just with words, but with your whole life. The lines blur between asking and thanking, between lament and hope, until your entire being is turned, quietly and steadily, toward what is good and true. Even rest and play are transformed. You allow yourself to delight in beauty, to savor joy without guilt, to accept the gift of rest as part of the rhythm of wholeness. Creativity, laughter, even moments of solitude become occasions for communion, reminders that you are a participant in a world rich with possibility and grace. You stop striving to be spiritual and simply allow yourself to be present, to receive, to respond, to belong. This new way of living is not about perfection or the absence of struggle. It is about living awake, anchored in meaning, tuned to the presence of God not just in extraordinary moments, but in the hidden places where life actually unfolds. Over time, this quiet, continuous prayer shapes the very contours of your character, your habits, your relationships. You realize that you are being transformed still, not by your effort, but by the steady work of grace in the midst of ordinary days. And so, as you move forward, you do so with a new confidence, that nothing is wasted, that every day is saturated with possibility, that your life, exactly as it is, has become, in all its mess and beauty, a living prayer. The miracle is not that everything has changed, but that you have, and through you, the world becomes just a little more open to hope. Change that begins in the hidden places of your soul rarely stays hidden. The work that grace has done in you, so quiet, so patient, so deeply personal, becomes, over time, a living invitation to everyone around you. Without effort or calculation, your presence begins to carry something different. People sense the peace that anchors you, the kindness that comes from being truly seen and loved, the patience born from having walked through your own darkness. You don't set out to inspire or to teach, but simply to live honestly, and that honesty shines. The light you carry is not the light of perfection, but of transformation. Friends and strangers alike notice the quiet steadiness in your reactions, the way you offer forgiveness, the way you listen without rushing to fix or judge. Some will ask where it comes from, perhaps in passing, perhaps in moments of their own need. Others may not ask, but they will feel it, a safe space, a sense of being welcomed just as they are. Your willingness to be vulnerable gives others permission to take off their own masks. The gentle acceptance you've learned becomes a refuge for those weary of performing or pretending. Sometimes your influence is visible, a conversation that shifts from small talk to real confession, a friend who seeks you out for comfort or wisdom, a coworker who finds hope in your calm amidst crisis. Other times it is invisible, felt only as a ripple effect, a smile that softens a hard day, a word that lingers in someone's memory, an act of generosity that sparks another. You begin to realize that to be a light is not about drawing attention to yourself, but about illuminating the goodness, dignity, and possibility in others. The story of your transformation weaves itself into the fabric of your community. You join the long tradition of those who have quietly shaped the world by their integrity, compassion, and hope. You discover that the smallest acts, a listening ear, a steady presence, a refusal to give up on someone, carry more weight than any argument or display. Through you, grace moves outward, meeting people in their own places of doubt and longing. As you continue living from this new center, you find your prayers and dreams growing larger than your own needs. You long for healing not only for yourself, but for those around you. Your heart aches for justice, for reconciliation, for the lonely and forgotten. The faith that has changed you now drives you to seek the good of others, to stand with the hurting, to speak hope into the cracks of a world that often feels harsh and indifferent. There is a beautiful paradox at work. The more honestly you embrace your own weakness and dependence on grace, the more strength you have to give. Your story, with all its imperfections and renewals, becomes a beacon, not because you have arrived, but because you have learned to walk with humility, to trust love over fear, and to believe that light is stronger than darkness. In this way, your life becomes a channel through which hope and courage flow. The boundaries of your personal experience dissolve, replaced by a sense of being part of something much greater, a community, a movement, a story of redemption that is still being written. You carry the light you've received, offering it freely, never knowing how far its glow will reach. And as you do, you witness the quiet miracle. The world around you, one encounter at a time, begins to change. There is a temptation, after all you have walked through, to imagine that you have reached a finish line, a final destination where every question is answered, every fear silenced, every weakness overcome. But as you settled into this new way of being, you discover the journey is anything but finished. The process of becoming whole, of living with honesty and hope, is not a project with an end point, but an unfolding story that deepens with every season. Each transformation reveals new horizons. Each victory opens the way for new questions. Even your greatest moments of clarity and peace are not conclusions, but invitations to travel further. You begin to see that the rhythm of the spiritual life is one of continual return, again and again, to truth, to humility, to gratitude, to forgiveness. Growth is not a staircase with a final step, but a spiral. You revisit old lessons with new eyes. You rediscover practices you thought you had outgrown, and you find depths of grace in places you never expected. What once felt like setbacks now seem like invitations to deepen your trust, to be patient with yourself, to stay rooted when progress feels slow or invisible. You are learning that faithfulness is less about heroic effort and more about gentle persistence, a willingness to begin again, no matter how many times you lose your way. The hope you carry is not a fragile optimism that denies hardship, but a living assurance that the journey itself is holy, that each season, bright or dark, has meaning. There will be days when the silence returns, when old fears resurface, when the light seems dim. On those days, you remember that you have walked this way before, and that the practices which carried you then are still available now. You learn to welcome the cycles of joy and sorrow, energy and fatigue, certainty and doubt, as part of the larger pattern of growth. Your sense of purpose shifts as well. The need for dramatic outcomes or final answers loosens its hold, replaced by a desire to simply remain present, to show up fully to whatever this day brings. You realize that the small, faithful choices, acts of kindness, moments of honesty, times of quiet, are the substance of a meaningful life. The future no longer frightens you, because you trust that you will be given what you need step by step. The journey ahead may be unknown, but it is not empty. It is filled with the promise that grace will meet you, again and again, in ways both familiar and new. The absence of a final point is not a cause for disappointment, but a source of freedom. You are released from the pressure to prove yourself or to measure your worth by arrival or achievement. Instead, you live as a pilgrim, open to change, ready to learn, willing to be surprised by joy. The road is long and sometimes winding, but you are never alone. Each day you are accompanied by the one who loves you, by the companions you gather, by the memories of those who walked before. In this ongoing journey, you find a quiet hope that cannot be shaken. There is always more to discover, always another step to take, always new ways to love and be loved. The invitation is not to arrive, but to continue, to walk in faith, to remain in hope, to abide in love. And as you keep moving forward, you realize that the journey itself, with all its twists and returns, is already the destination you were seeking all along.